Things are getting increasingly heated on the campaign trail in the Democratic primary race between Secretary Hillary Clinton and Senator Bernie Sanders as they approach the critical New York primary on April 19th. This is especially true on the issue of guns. Last week, Hillary Clinton tweeted, "Bernie Sanders prioritized gun manufacturers' rights over the parents of the children killed at Sandy Hook," which prompted outrage from Sanders supporters and accusations that Clinton was politicizing the tragedy. And when asked by a reporter what his response is to the Sandy Hook families, who say he should apologize for his position on immunity for gun manufacturers, Sanders responded by saying,
"Maybe Secretary Clinton might want to apologize to the families who lost their loved ones in Iraq."
The issue at the heart of this exchange is a law that was passed in 2005 called the Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act, or PLCAA. Sanders voted for this bill. Clinton voted against it. Currently, the victims' families of the Sandy Hook massacre are attempting to sue the manufacturers of the AR-15, but may be blocked from doing so because of this law. The reasoning behind their votes is best exemplified by this exchange at the Democratic debate in Flint, Michigan.
Giving immunity to gun makers and sellers was a terrible mistake because it removed any accountability from the makers and the sellers. And it also disrupted what was a very promising legal theory to try to get makers to do more to make guns safer, for example, to try to give sellers more accountability for selling guns when they shouldn't have. I think we should very seriously move to repeal that and go back to making sure gun makers and sellers are like any other business. They can be held accountable.
If you go to a gun store and you legally purchase a gun, and then 3 days later, you go out and you start killing people, is the point of this lawsuit to hold the gun shop owner or the manufacturer of that gun liable? If that is the point, I have to tell you I disagree. What you're really talking about is ending gun manufacturing in America. I don't agree with that.
Sanders has called the law a complicated bill with some good things and bad things, and said he was willing to rethink the issue, even pledging to repeal the law he once voted for. Yet on the central issue of immunity, his stance remains unchanged, saying this to the New York Daily News recently when asked about the Sandy Hook family's lawsuit. "Do I think the victims of a crime with a gun should be able to sue the manufacturer? Is that your question? No, I don't." So who's right? Let's dig a little deeper and take a look at the law itself. The PLCAA grants legal protection to gun manufacturers and dealers, shielding them from liability for a wide range of conduct. There are a few exceptions in the law, including knowingly selling to criminals and damages incurred directly from a defect in the gun's design. Opponents of the law claim that the gun industry has marketed and distributed their firearms in ways which they know or should know create and feed an illegal secondary market in firearms. This secondary market allows unauthorized purchasers such as felons to obtain guns for use in crime, and that manufacturers have failed to implement safer designs that would prevent unauthorized use of handguns by children and others. The argument in favor of the law tends to break down like this. If it's not illegal to make or sell a particular type of gun, it's not the gun manufacturer's fault that someone used the gun to kill someone, right? This reasoning even has people like Bill Maher and Donald Trump supporter Andy Dean in agreement.
Bernie was asked, should a victim of a crime committed with a gun be able to sue the gun manufacturer? And Bernie said no. And he's right.
Right.
A gun is a legal product.
Right. Even a socialist gets that.
The logic seems pretty sound. If the gun's legal, why should the gun maker or seller be held responsible for someone else's crime? But this argument misses the point. The issue is not whether these guns are legal or illegal, it's whether gun manufacturers and dealers are acting reasonably and responsibly in the interest of public health and safety. As a society, we make decisions about how to balance the risks and benefits of consumer products. One way we strike that balance is by allowing litigation against product makers when risks become too great. In this way, litigation can act as a public health feedback mechanism to affect manufacturers' safety practices. For example, it's legal to make and sell cigarettes, but it's irresponsible to market cigarettes to children. It's legal to offer lending services, but it's irresponsible to market it and sell it to people who can't afford it. It's legal to make and prescribe painkillers, but it's irresponsible to market it and prescribe it to drug abusers. It's legal to store natural gas, but it's irresponsible when your gas well leaks 100,000 tons of methane into the air. And Sanders has railed against every one of these industries for their irresponsible behavior. In all of these examples, lawsuits have held these industries accountable for their irresponsible behavior and have caused them to change their practices. Civil lawsuits have prompted automakers to make cars with airbags, safer seatbelts, power window switches to protect children, and safer gas tanks that don't explode on impact. And sometimes these lawsuits take time to make change. In the early 1970s, the courts regularly ruled with automobile manufacturers that vehicles without airbags were not defective or unreasonably dangerous. But as a result of continued lawsuits, airbags are now standard features in automobiles, and automobile collisions are less likely to result in serious injury or death. And the NRA was concerned that lawsuits like this would eventually succeed and expose the gun industry to costly litigation, which is why the NRA called this law the most significant piece of pro-gun legislation in 20 years. In 2000, lawsuits prompted Smith & Wesson to adopt new safety practices, including selling additional safety devices with each handgun and including a hidden set of serial numbers inside of all guns to make it more difficult for criminals to scratch off identifying marks. In 2002, after the DC snipers murdered 17 people, it was discovered that the gun manufacturer, Bushmaster, had continuously supplied a particular gun seller despite the store's known negligence of losing documentation for hundreds of guns over a 3-year period that were supposed to be in their inventory, including the weapon used in the murders. Both the dealer and the manufacturer were held liable in a $2.5 million settlement, and Bushmaster agreed to change their distribution practices. But since the passage of the PLCAA, these types of outcomes have become nearly impossible. In 2012, Lonnie Phillips, whose daughter was among the 11 people killed in the Aurora Theater shooting, sued the companies that sold thousands of rounds of ammunition, including a 100-round ammunition magazine, to the killer. Phillips claimed that the seller's negligent internet business practices did not provide reasonable safeguards to prevent potentially dangerous individuals from obtaining weapons. The case was dismissed as a result of the PLCAA, and Lonnie Phillips was forced to pay the ammunition company over $200,000 in legal fees. Which brings us back to today, where the Sandy Hook victims' families are suing Remington, the maker of the AR-15, not because they manufacture the weapon, but because of the company's irresponsible marketing and sales practices. And even if you were to disagree with any particular lawsuit, courts already have the power to throw out frivolous cases. So why should the gun industry uniquely enjoy broad legal immunity that prevents legitimate litigation, a status that is not afforded to any other industry? Gun violence is a public health crisis. Guns account for the deaths of over 30,000 people a year. And while certainly there are many causes for that, the irresponsible marketing and distribution practices and the gun makers' refusal to implement reasonable safety measures is clearly a major culprit, as well as the irresponsible selling practices of a small minority of gun dealers. Research shows that 5% of gun dealers are responsible for selling the weapons involved in 90% of gun crimes in the United States. And the legal immunity that the gun industry uniquely enjoys as a result of the passage of the PLCAA takes away one of the American people's most effective tools to force this grossly irresponsible industry who prioritizes profit over public health and safety to make the changes necessary to save lives. So when Bernie Sanders says,
What you're really talking about is ending gun manufacturing in America, I don't agree with that.
he's missing the point. And when Hillary Clinton says,
Giving immunity to gun makers and sellers was a terrible mistake,
she's right on the money. Is it fair to say that Bernie Sanders prioritized gun manufacturers' rights over the parents of the children killed at Sandy Hook? I'll leave that up to you to decide, but I think it's safe to say that either he hasn't done his research on the issue, or he's just plain wrong.